Welcome to our fish identification video. This is part of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Hooked on Fishing program, where we try and help students around the state of Montana develop a little bit of an appreciation and an awareness of the really special fish and water resources that we have here in Montana. Our title for this is all about Montana's fantastic fish, and we're going to try and cover some of the basic facts about the fish that live here in Montana and what makes this such a special place for people and for fish alike. In this slide and video program, we're going to look at a number of the different fish that we have here in Montana and try and figure out what makes them so well adapted to survive here and what we can learn by looking at the fish. So our objective here, there's a bunch of different things that we want you to learn, and in fair warning, we're going to ask you some of these questions again at the end of this program. So here's what we'd like for you to be able to answer when we're all done. First of all, how many different kinds of fish live here in Montana? Lots of vocabulary words, and the first one will be the word anatomy. What does the word anatomy mean? What's the biggest fish in Montana? Also, what's the smallest fish in Montana? What's the term? What do we call a person who studies fish? Which Montana fish was here long before dinosaurs? What are two things that our fish use their fins for? What are three things that fish use their barbels for? Of course, we'll have to learn what barbels are to begin with. Which big fish in Montana eats only plankton? What's the definition of a native fish? Who grows larger, male or female fish? Which fish is the most popular in Montana, both in the summer and in the winter? And finally, what's the state fish of Montana? So let's get started. First good question we need to learn is, how many different fish do we even have that live here in the state of Montana? We're not an especially wet state. We're a dry state. In some cases, Montana's a desert state. We have such low precipitation amounts, but our fish here are pretty unique. And when we look at all the different types of fish, we can compare it to things like mammals: deer, elk, bears, porcupines, skunks, weasels. There are about 100, just a little over 100 different kinds of mammals in Montana. Most people are pretty familiar with the birds that live here, and there's over 400 different kinds of birds. But what about fish? How many fish do we have here in Montana? Right now, we believe there's 91 different species of fish that are found in the state. We break those into two categories. We talk about native fish, which in the definition of a native fish or a native animal or a native person is just something that's always been found here. So our native fish would be the fish that have always lived in Montana. They were never brought here by humans and released. We think there's about 57 of the 91 species that we have in Montana are native. So 57 species would have been found here. If you would have visited Montana 500 years ago, we would have had 57 species of fish. That also means, since that time, we've introduced other fish or brought them here from other places. Introduced means a type of fish or an animal that's not originally from Montana. And if you do the math, if there's 91 species of fish right now, 57 are native, that means that about 34 species were brought here by humans. So we have 57 native species and 34 introduced species of fish. If you're one of those people who really loves fish and you want to make learning about fish your life's work, there's a special term for that. Just like there's paleontologists and archaeologists, there are fishologists. Of course, it's never that simple. There's usually a Greek or a Latin word. And the Greek word for somebody who studies fish is an ichthyologist. Ichthy, I-C-H-T-H-Y, means fish, and ologist is somebody who studies something. So if you decide to be an ichthyologist, you're going to spend your time studying and learning all about fish. A big part of ichthyology is learning all the different types of fish where you live. So one of the first things we're going to do today is to give you a little bit of a fish quiz. We're going to see how well you know some of the maybe the better known fish in Montana and also some that are a little harder to figure out. So I'll show you some of the fish on here and we'll see how well you can do identifying them. Our first fish in our little fish identification quiz today is going to be one that's well known, or will be well known to most of the students that are in Hooked on Fishing. They're likely to catch one of these. They're likely to see them in their classroom as well. The girl in the picture is holding up one of these fish, and there's a good drawing of it down below. So, first question would be, what type of fish is this? What's the name of this one? And this fish is a perch, or even more appropriately, a yellow perch would be more correct. Next question is, are perch native or are they introduced to Montana? Have they always been found here or were they brought here from somewhere else? And really, there's no way. You can't just look at a perch and determine and say, oh, that's a native fish, or no, that's not a native fish. It's really more of a historical thing. And in our case, in Montana, perch are considered to be introduced. They've been here just a little bit more than 100 years. We already said perch are well known to most of the students that are in Hooked on Fishing. They're well known to a lot of people in Montana, especially if they like to fish in the winter through the ice. Perch are the most popular fish in the state of Montana during the winter. More people fish for perch than for anything else, and this picture maybe helps explain why that is. Perch are numerous. You can catch a lot of perch. And we've had students in our classes go out and catch 10 or 20, sometimes even 30 or 40 perch just in a few hours of fishing on the ice. So even though they don't get very big, you can see the size of these perch that this boy is catching. They're not gigantic fish, but they're numerous. They're common. They're sometimes pretty easy to catch, we hope, and they're good to eat. So people that like to eat fish, they usually like to eat perch. In our Hooked on Fishing program, we use perch in our classrooms. Schools will a lot of times go out and do an ice fishing trip in the winter. They'll catch a bunch of perch and we'll save some of those and bring them into the classroom later on in the winter or early in spring, and they'll do their fish dissection. And the dissection on perch for a lot of people is the first time they've ever been had the chance to do a dissection. And it's a pretty unique, it's probably the most well-liked activity of all the activities that we do in the classrooms. And over the years, over the decades, for thousands of students in Montana, yellow perch has been the first fish they ever caught through the ice, or maybe the first fish they've ever caught in their life. And our great tradition, our long tradition here, is when we're out fishing and we catch a perch, especially if it's your first one, you plant a big old kiss right on that fish's head before you let it go. Our next fish, pretty cool, really, really cool fish. Really, really big fish. You can see he's got one there in his lap. This is a fish that's a little bit lesser known in Montana, but it's a really important one here. So the name of this fish is a paddlefish. You can see where it gets its name. It's got a big paddle for a nose, a big bill. Sometimes that's a foot or two, or almost 3 feet long in some cases. Paddlefish, when we ask if they're native or introduced, they're one of our fish that's native. They've always been brought here. They've always been found here. In the big river systems, they're in eastern Montana, in the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. We don't find them in the cold water. They like the warmer, slower rivers. The important thing about paddlefish is they are our very largest fish. The biggest paddlefish ever caught in Montana weighed over 142 pounds, more than 6 feet long. So really a giant fish, one of the biggest fish in the world, certainly the biggest fish here in Montana. This is a fish that's a little bit easier for a lot of people to recognize. This one is a rainbow trout. And rainbows are a little bit different when we talk about whether they're native or introduced. In most cases in Montana, for about 95% of the state, we say rainbows are introduced. They're not native. They were never found here. There's a small part of Montana, though, up in the far northwest corner near the Idaho border, near the Canadian border, where rainbows, there's a different subspecies or a different type of rainbow trout that always was native. And rainbows are kind of a big deal in Montana because they are our most popular fish during the summer months in Montana. So remember, we already said yellow perch are the most popular fish in the winter. Well, during the summer, it's rainbow trout. So more people fish for, or more people catch rainbow trout in Montana during the summer than any other fish. And there's a reason for that too. They get pretty large. They get bigger than perch. They're very common. They're not always very difficult to catch. Sometimes they're hard to catch, but sometimes they're easy to catch. Makes them a really good, popular fish for Montana. And for a lot of people, maybe their first fish they've ever caught is a rainbow trout, or maybe their favorite fish to go fish for is a rainbow trout. Here's another really popular fish in Montana. This one is called a walleye. And if you kind of look at that fish's eye, you can see where it gets its name. It has a really large eye, which is a feature that we will talk about in just a few minutes and what that means for a fish. Walleyes, we believe, are introduced to Montana. Again, they were brought here just a little bit over 100 years ago. They're now pretty widespread, especially found in eastern and central Montana, around Helena and Great Falls and Havre and Glasgow and Miles City. You can find walleyes, and they're a very, very popular fish. And they're especially good to eat as well. Even for people who aren't always the best at identifying all the different fish that we have in Montana, this fish is one that a lot of people can identify, and it's a catfish. More specifically, it's called a channel catfish. That's the type that we have here in Montana. And channel catfish are considered to be native. They've always been found in Montana. They were never brought here and released by anybody. And they're a fish that's a little bit different because they really prefer warm water. If we think a trout like a rainbow trout, they like cold water. Catfish, though, would be a type of fish that likes warm water. And almost the warmer, the better. So eastern Montana, where the rivers get a little bit warmer and a little bit slower, is typically where we find catfish. And there's some really cool, unique features about catfish that catfish have that other fish don't. And that's something we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Here's a fish that we want everybody to know by the time you're done learning about the fish in Montana. This one is a cutthroat trout. And cutthroats are really special here in Montana for a reason that you'll see in just a second. Cutthroats are considered to be native to Montana. They've always been found here. The first people to ever give them the name cutthroats was some people on the Lewis and Clark expedition. When Lewis and Clark came through Montana in the very early 1800s, they pulled up to the Great Falls on the Missouri River, where the city of Great Falls now is, and they started to catch this fish, and they looked at it and they said, hey, look at underneath the jaw on this fish. And I'll kind of point to it here a little bit. There's a red line underneath that jaw. And they said, we're going to name this cutthroat trout because of that. We've never seen these before. Of course, the Native Americans that were here for thousands of years knew all about cutthroat trout, but Lewis and Clark are considered the ones who gave them that name. Cutthroats are actually the state fish of Montana, which is why it's so important, why we want everybody to know about them. They're our state fish, and they're found in other states as well, but here in Montana we consider them to be a pretty special part of what makes Montana what it is. It's not always easy to identify a cutthroat trout. The fish in the lower right corner underwater is a cutthroat trout, but if you cannot see under its jaw, it's really hard to tell. When you can get a fish and look underneath its jaw, like you see on the next fish up there, with that big red line underneath its jaw, on its throat, it looks like somebody cut the fish's throat, that's where it gets its name. So we always look for that when we catch a trout or one of these fish with lots of spots on it. And if we see that red line, we can usually assume that it's a cutthroat trout. It's our state fish. How about minnows? The boy in the picture has a minnow in his hand. You have to look pretty close. And to a lot of people, the word minnow just means a small fish, or maybe even a baby. They think, oh, it's just a little baby fish. It's a minnow. Well, a minnow is not just a small fish. Even though the one he has in his hand is small, he's also holding a minnow in the other picture on the right side of the screen. And that's a minnow. So a minnow is not just a small fish. A minnow is actually a type of fish. And the one he has in his hand is called a brook stickleback, and that's about as big as they get, about the size of your finger, or maybe the size of your pinky finger. That's a full-grown brook stickleback. The fish he's also holding up in the other picture is a minnow, and we have minnows in Montana like that get to 20, 30, even 40 pounds. So don't be confused. A minnow is not just a small fish. A minnow is actually a group of fish, a whole bunch of similar fish. There's about 30 different kinds of minnows in Montana. Some are big, some are small. So like we've already said, there's 91 different types of fish in Montana. And even the very best ichthyologists, the people who study fish, have a hard time identifying some of these. And certainly those of us who don't look at fish every day have a hard time. So what we want to do next, after we've looked at some of those fish already on the quiz, is we want to talk about some of the features, some of the things that you can notice when you look at a fish. So even if you don't know what kind of fish it is, and in this case, the fish is a walleye, which is one we already looked at. It's got that great big eyeball. But things that you can look at on a fish that can help you know things about the fish, even if you don't know its name. And what we're going to look at on the fish are the body parts. And when we talk about body parts on a fish or an animal, the word for that, those parts, when we study those parts, is anatomy. And when we do a fish dissection in class, we'll be looking at the internal anatomy, like you see on this fish right here, the heart and the brain and the stomach and the muscles and the bones and the kidneys. Today, though, when we talk about identifying fish, we're going to look at the external or the outside anatomy, the features on the outside of the fish that can help us understand more about that fish when we look at it. One of the first and most obvious things on a fish that makes a fish different from any other animal is that they have fins on their body. And the fins are used for two primary different things, two major things that they do with their fins. First one, of course, is to move through the water. And their tail, or their caudal fin, as the ichthyologists would call it, the caudal fin is used to propel the fish. It's kind of the engine or the motor. It moves back and forth and it gets the fish moving in a straight line. So fins are used to get the fish moving. And then, of course, they have to turn or steer their body, and they use some other fins for that. So we'll take a look at some of those fins. So where the fins are located on the fish's body tells you a lot about what they do and what the fish is good at doing. The fish that just showed up here is called a gar. It's a long, skinny, kind of a torpedo-looking fish, and it's got lots of fins on the back of its body, back towards its tail. So a fish like that with a lot of fins back here and also kind of in the body shape that it has probably is going to be really good at moving in a straight line and moving pretty fast. So a fish like a gar is going to be really fast and able to accelerate and probably outswim most other fish. The fish that just showed up here is called a crappie, and crappies are kind of round, and although they do have fins at the back of their body, they've also got a lot of fins in the middle of their body. And fins in the middle of a fish's body tell us that it's probably better at turning and steering than it is at just swimming really fast. So if you look at the two fish, a gar on the bottom, a crappie above it, one of those is more likely to be a predator fish. One of those is more likely to be the prey species or the prey fish that the predator is trying to eat. If you want to be a predator, you've got to be fast. You've got to be able to catch your prey. So the gar on the bottom with fins at the back of its body is fast and is probably more of a predator. The crappie above it with fins in the middle of its body is really good at steering and dodging and turning and ducking to get out of the way. It's more likely to be the prey species. If you look at the mouth on a fish, there's so many different mouth shapes and sizes and locations on the fish's body. And that also tells an awful lot about where the fish lives and where it finds its food. So we'll look at a few different fish with different shaped and sizes of mouths. Oh, this is a beautiful fish. This is a river carpsucker, a great big eye, and a mouth that's towards the bottom of its body. And that tells you something right away. With the mouth down there on the bottom, this is a fish that's adapted, or it's kind of designed really well to get its food from the bottom of the river. This fish is a rainbow trout, one that we just looked at a few minutes ago. We know it's not a cutthroat because it doesn't have the big orange cut mark underneath its jaw. So it's a rainbow trout, and it's got a body, a mouth that's really found more in the middle of its body. It's not near the top, it's not near the bottom, it's just kind of right on the end of its body in the middle, which means that it could get its food from the bottom, could get its food from the top, could get its food from anywhere in the middle of the lake or the river. So it's a fish that's that's really well adapted to feed just about anywhere. This fish is a carp, which is one of our biggest minnows. It gets over 40 pounds. And carp have a really unique sort of mouth. It's almost more like a big straw or a vacuum cleaner hose. So when the carp is swimming around down by the bottom, because its mouth is sort of angled towards the bottom, as they swim along the bottom, if they find some food down there, they can extend that big sort of a tube-shaped mouth and just go and suck the food right up off the bottom. This fish is a type of sucker, and there's probably close to 20 different types of suckers in Montana. Suckers have mouths on the bottom of their head, so this fish is actually upside down. His mouth is pointed up, his eyes are pointed down. If he would be swimming in the water normally, his mouth would be on the bottom, where it would be looking for food. His eyes would be up above, so it's not going to see its food. Its eyes are going to be looking up above it, which is a really good adaptation for a fish that has predators that might be coming from up above. It can look for food down on the bottom while its eyes are watching for predators over its head. If you look closely at the mouth or the lips of that fish, all those little bumps are on there. And if you try and think, what could those be? What purpose would those little bumps be? Think of something inside of your mouth that's covered with little tiny bumps like that. Your tongue. And covering your tongue are taste buds. And those are really forms of taste buds right there on the lips of that fish. So since their eyes are pointed the other direction, they don't look for their food with their eyes. They taste for their food with their lips down on the bottom. Some of our fish in Montana have no teeth at all. Some of our fish have small teeth that you can barely see. And some of our fish have bigger teeth. This fish is a walleye, and if you look, it's one of those fish with bigger teeth. But they're not big teeth like a human or a mammal has, like a cow or an elk, to chew and grind up its food. Fish don't really swallow their food. They have these sharp teeth so they can grab their food, and their food is usually something that's alive. It's another fish or it's an animal in the water. They have to grab onto that thing that's alive and swallow it head first. So as they grab it, they need teeth that are good at gripping something and good at holding it. And you can also see the teeth angle in towards the fish's throat, which means the food can slide into the fish's throat fairly easily, but it's really hard for it to get back out because the teeth are angled in that direction. Although we don't have sharks that live in Montana, we do have some fish that have as many or maybe even more teeth than a shark does, and this would be a good example of one of those fish. This is called a northern pike, and it is probably our toothiest fish, if that's a word. They have hundreds and hundreds of teeth in their mouth, and they're adapted to grab onto other fish and swallow those fish down as quickly as they possibly can. And remember, we said our fish don't have teeth to chew their food. They have teeth to grab onto their food. That's usually another live fish. So here's a northern pike with all of its hundreds of teeth that grabbed onto a really large fish that was too big for it to swallow. It got caught in the pike's throat, and the pike choked on it. So this would probably be an example of a fish that wishes it could chew its food up a little bit. Here's our old friend, the catfish, the one that people are good at identifying. And the word barbels across the top of this page, B-A-R-B-E-L-S, describes something on that catfish that it uses to find its food, right around its mouth. And the barbels are just a fancy word for the whiskers on a catfish or another fish. And catfish have a lot of barbels. And they use those barbels to find their food. They look, although in the picture they look pointy and sharp, they're really not. They're made of cartilage, just like your ears or your nose. They're kind of soft and squishy, but they're covered with different nerve endings that help a catfish to find its food. So the way that the catfish uses its barbels or its whiskers, or the other fish here in the upper left corner called a burbot, the way that they use those is they use their barbels instead of their eyes to find their food. With eyes you could see your food. Well, catfish use their barbels, and with their barbels they can feel for their food. They can touch, swim along near the bottom, and their barbels brush over things, and if they feel something that feels like food, they can eat it. They can also smell a little bit with their barbels. So their barbels actually have smell receptors, and if they can smell something with food that smells like food, they can eat it. Some of their barbels even have taste buds on them. So it's like your tongue. They can swim along with their barbels, and as their barbels brush over things, they can taste it and decide if it's something they want to eat or not. So for fish like catfish that live maybe in muddier, slower, murky water where they can't see very well, they can use their barbels as a way to help them find their food instead. Here's another fish with barbels in Montana, although it's not a catfish. This one's called a sturgeon. And this sturgeon in this picture you can see has 4 barbels that hang down right underneath its head in front of its mouth. And the barbels are covered with those little bumps, which, if you think back to one of those other fish we looked at, the little bumps all over its lips were taste buds. And these are taste buds all over the barbels of this sturgeon. So as the sturgeon is swimming along, its barbels can taste and feel for food down on the bottom. Here's a good picture of a pallid sturgeon, which is a type of sturgeon in Montana, our largest sturgeon. It's one of our biggest fish of all. Found in eastern Montana in the big rivers, in the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. And you can see at the front of that fish there are some long curved barbels hanging down. And that's how that fish finds its food. And we'll look at those in just a second. So here's a bunch of sturgeon down on the bottom of the river, and you can see their barbels hanging down from underneath their head. And as they swim along, as those barbels come into contact with things that taste or smell or feel like food, sturgeon have one of those long vacuum cleaner suction hose kind of mouths behind their barbels. And when the barbels feel something, that mouth comes down and they can suck up their food off the bottom. And if you look right above the fish's mouth, you can see its eyes and how small they are, which is something that we'll talk about in just a minute or two, what that tells us about a fish. But sturgeon are really unique in Montana. They're such an old, ancient, prehistoric fish, and we know that because when people dig for fossils, they can find dinosaur fossils. If you dig down into the ground, especially in eastern Montana, you might find a layer of dinosaur bones, fossil bones. A lot of times buried underneath those dinosaur bones are sturgeon fossils. And that tells us something right away. The deeper we dig in the ground, the older the fossils get. So if the sturgeon fossils are underneath the dinosaur fossils, we know sturgeon are actually older than dinosaurs. So that's a fish, when people catch a sturgeon and they pick one up, they say, wow, this is a fish that's been swimming around here in Montana for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, 40, 50, 60 million years, we've had sturgeon in Montana. So even though the dinosaurs are gone, we still have a fish that really is as old as the dinosaurs. They're from the time of the dinosaurs that still lives here. So people sometimes even call sturgeon a living fossil because they've been here so long. Even though fish have lots of different color patterns, the colors are there for a reason, and the best reason is camouflage. So if you look at a fish, even though they may not look anything alike, a lot of fish have the same features. Their backs, the top of the fish is often dark colored. The belly or the bottom of the fish is often lightly colored. And then in the middle of its body, there's some different markings and different shapes. The dark back is a good adaptation, a good camouflage to protect from predators from up above. So if there is a hawk or an osprey or an eagle swimming over the water, looking down into the water for a fish, what they see is the dark back of the fish that blends in with the dark bottom of the pond. From underneath, if there's a big fish down on the bottom, say one of those northern pike with their hundreds of teeth, looking up for a fish to eat, and one of these fish, the perch on the bottom, or the pumpkin seed it's called, up in the upper left corner, swims over, that light-colored belly on that fish blends in with the sky up above. So it's camouflage from above, it's camouflage differently from below, and from the side, all those markings are there to help the fish blend in with hiding places in the water, sticks or weeds or vegetation that grows, plants that grow in the water. All those are good camouflage patterns for fish to have. We've looked at lots of different fish already. A walleye in the bottom of this picture with a big eye compared to a catfish in the top of the picture with a small eye. And the size of the fish's eye is a good indication of how well it sees. So a fish with a big eye like a walleye has good eyesight, it has very good vision. They live in clear water where they can see what they're looking for to eat. Fish like a catfish with small eyes has vision that's not as good, so they rely on their barbels, or those whiskers, to help find their food. So when you see a fish or an animal that has big eyes, it means it has good eyesight. When you see a fish or an animal with small eyes, it means it usually doesn't have, its eyesight is not as good. A lot of times when we catch a fish, we wonder, wow, is this a boy or a girl, a male or a female? Most of the time, we can't determine that. In this case, here's a bunch of perch that somebody caught, and they're kind of big and round, so maybe they're females and they have eggs inside, but we really can't tell. The only way you can tell, usually on a fish, is to look internally, inside of the fish, for some of the body parts or eggs that would tell us whether it's a male or a female, whether it's a boy or a girl. There are a few cases and a few fish in Montana where it's easier to tell, though, whether you have a male or a female. And here you can see there's 3 fish on this picture. All 3 of those fish are the same kind. They're a kokanee salmon. And that's a common type of salmon that we have here in Montana. And most of the year, the kokanee salmon are kind of a bright silver color, like the one in the bottom left side of the screen. And that's good camouflage. If you live in open water where the water's kind of shiny and silvery, you want your body to be shiny and silvery. During the fall, though, which is the time of the year when the kokanee salmon spawn or lay their eggs, that's when they're going to breed and lay eggs, especially with the males first, start to change colors. And they change from that bright silver color to a dark red color, and their heads turn purple, and their jaws start to grow out and curve around. That's really not good camouflage at all, is it? If you think about it, it makes you very, very noticeable. And you have to maybe ask yourself, well, who would the boy salmon want to notice them? Of course, it's the girl salmon. If you were a girl kokanee salmon and this bright red male swam by you, well, you would just think that was the most beautiful fish you'd ever see. So the bright red color attracts attention from the females. And then those big hooked jaws that kind of grow, and it takes a month or 2 for their jaw to grow like that, and it curves over and covers up their teeth. And that's the way the males, when there's more males than there are females, the males have to fight over the females. And the way fish fight is to kind of take their heads and ram into the other fish and try and scare them off that way. And those big hooked jaws can let the fish hit each other, kind of like you putting a boxing glove on. You could hit your friend and you could have fun fighting without really hurting each other. And those hooked jaws are a way to do that. So if you ever catch a fish with a great big hooked jaw, really, really brightly colored like one of these kokanee salmon, a lot of times that's a pretty good indication that it's a male or a boy fish, and it's getting ready to breed with the females. We have to talk a little bit about size of our fish in Montana. There's a huge range of sizes, from fish like this paddlefish on the bottom, 6.5 feet long, over 140 pounds. That's our biggest fish, a paddlefish. The smallest fish, though, is a little bit harder to figure out, because it's hard to say what's the very smallest fish ever caught. Well, the smallest in the state record book is a type of fish called a shiner, and it's that small little fish right in the middle up above. It's about 3.5 inches long and 1/100th of a pound. So a shiner is our smallest fish. Paddlefish is our largest fish. Here's a good example of another one of our very, very small fish called a mosquito fish, named because they live in warm water and they like to eat mosquitoes. She's got one in the palm of her hand. That would be another example of a fish that's just tiny, barely bigger than a pencil eraser, one of our very smallest fish in Montana. Here's our biggest fish in Montana, though, and this is not even a very large one, but it's a paddlefish. And if you look at a paddlefish, there's some really unique things about paddlefish. They've got that big paddle on their head. They've got tiny, tiny little eyes, which means they have pretty poor eyesight, and they've got a great big mouth. So we have to think, what do paddlefish eat in order to get to be 5 or 6 feet long and maybe over 100 pounds? This paddlefish is maybe only 20 or 25 pounds, so it's a pretty small paddlefish. But they use that bill, or that long paddle on their head. It has nerve receptors that can detect electricity, and paddlefish have a really, really unique diet. They only eat plankton. And plankton are those little tiny plants and animals in the water that we can't even see. They're microscopic in size. And paddlefish don't see them. Instead, they can follow their paddle as sort of like a radio antenna It can kind of steer them to places where there's a lot of plankton in the muddy water where they live. And then they can open up that gigantic mouth of theirs and try and eat the plankton. But with their small eyes and their bad eyesight, paddlefish don't see the plankton at all. With their mouth open, the water and the plankton go into their mouth. The water comes out through their gill openings on the side of their head, but the plankton gets caught at the back of their throat. So they can swim 24 hours a day with their mouth open. Fish don't ever really sleep the same way that we do. They swim along with their mouth open through that muddy water, filtering the plankton out of the water, just like a whale filters the plankton out of the ocean water. So they can do that for 30 or 40 or 50 years over the course of their lifespan. They live a long time, they never stop eating, and they get really big. If you ever catch a really big paddlefish, and this might be maybe a 50 or 60 pound paddlefish, so still only a lot smaller than the largest size paddlefish. The question you might have then is, who gets bigger? Do the boys or the girls get bigger? And we know for animals like mammals, or humans, which were mammals, the males, the boys get bigger. Fish are the opposite though, and it's the females that get to be really big. And the reason is they have to carry around thousands and thousands of eggs inside their body. So if you ever catch a really big paddlefish or a really big trout, most likely that fish is a female. Okay, so we've made it through looking at a bunch of different fish in Montana, but here's some of the questions that we said we wanted to answer when we were done. The first question is, how many different kinds of fish live in Montana? We said there's 91 total different types of fish, 57 are native, and 34 are introduced. What does the word anatomy mean? Well, anatomy is when we study the body parts of an animal. In our case, it's when we study fish body parts. If you just study fish in general, the name for a person who studies fish is an ichthyologist. I-C-H-T-H-Y-O-L-O-G-I-S-T, ichthyologist. The biggest and smallest fish in Montana, pretty big range. The biggest fish, over 150 pounds, is a paddlefish. The smallest fish, the two small fish that we looked at, pictures of, were mosquito fish and shiners. We looked at a fish that's ancient and prehistoric. They've been on the earth for millions of years. That fish in Montana is known as a sturgeon. The one we said was the living fossil for Montana. When we look at the anatomy of a fish and their fins, the two things a fish uses its fins for, the two most important are to move through the water and to steer or turn its body. The three things that a fish uses its barbels for are to find food, by smelling, by tasting, or by touching for its food. The fish in Montana that only eats plankton is that giant fish, the paddlefish. Uses its paddle to help find the plankton in the muddy water. Our definition of a native fish, a good example would be a paddlefish, is a fish that's always been found here. Native fish has never been introduced, it's always lived somewhere. Who gets bigger, a male or a female? Females get bigger than males because they have to carry so many eggs in their body. The most popular fish in Montana in the winter would be a yellow perch. The most popular fish in the summer in Montana would be a rainbow trout. And finally, what's the state fish of Montana? Don't forget this one. It's a cutthroat trout. Our state fish is a cutthroat. Well, congratulations. You've made it to the end of the fish identification show. Hope you've learned something about the 91 different types of fish we have here in Montana. And hopefully you want to learn a little bit more in the future. Thanks for joining us.